This evening we've got a pretty packed programme. A fantastic lecture first from Imru Bakari, followed by a great panel who I'll introduce to you later. The idea is to encourage discussion. So you may hear things that you find challenging. You may hear some things that you don't necessarily agree with. Let's get involved in the debate and get involved in the discussions. But in order for that to happen, I really would appreciate people listening to each other as well as contributing questions and joining in the discussion. It seems we live in a society where people don't talk enough about racism. They talk a lot about those incidents like John Terry on the pitch, but they don't talk about some of the structural patterns which leave large groups marginalised, which means that over 50% of young black men are still seeking work, that black men are 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched on the street, that a Chinese graduate earns 25% over the course of their 25% less over the course of their life than a white graduate. And while this racism still persists in our society, we rely on the information that we have, and we rely on the media as a route to spark conversation, to spark debate, to spark discussion, but also to reflect the society of which it is part. And there's a real question mark over whether our current media, films and broadcast media, actually represent the diversity of our society sufficiently. And that's part of the reason why we're very keen to open up this discussion and have this debate with you here this evening. It's a debate which we started in Birmingham on Friday, and we're going to Manchester tomorrow. The aim is to have a film at the end of this that we can share with a broader range of people. So, without really much further ado, let's get started with our evening. And I'd like to introduce to you our lecturer who's going to give a short but very engaging presentation. It's Imru Bakari. He's a filmmaker, writer and creative industries consultant. He's currently a senior fellow in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Winchester, where he lectures in film and media studies. Imru is also the co-coordinator of Big City Stories, an archive film compilation charting the African Caribbean presence in London. So, Imru, over to you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Runnymede Trust, for inviting me to be part of this occasion, this series of lectures. And I'd like to thank you too for coming here. We have a very tight program, and I wanted to get straight into the presentation which I hope to make and share a few ideas with you. We'll just put that there. Importantly, just as a brief, I've also been working a lot outside of UK. I have had a long association with the University of Winchester, but I also work in East Africa and very much part of what I would call the global African community. And I think that's important to my perspectives as they have developed over the last, let's say, 30 years, which is the period I'm going to be addressing principally. Now, in contemplating the title series of these discussions, the title of the series of discussions of which this one is a part, Race, Racism, Resistance on Film, there is immediately in my mind the awareness of how the everyday use of terminology and concepts assume a common understanding. In doing so, not only are unhelpful myths sometimes perpetuated, but equally and probably more significantly, productive debate is often curtailed in ways in which ideas or questions are framed. In this regard, I have chosen not to speak directly about race. The reason being that it is, in my view, a discredited concept, useful only as political rhetoric. And I'm not a politician. Instead, what will be addressed is racism. Racism, resistance, and film. How is it possible to speak about racism and not race, you may ask? Now, therefore, in order to proceed, I will make a few brief comments. And the first is this, that the concept of race is a product of a spurious and outdated 19th century science. It is a long outdated set of ideas which are no longer viable in contemporary society. It can be seen to be a science developed to legitimize a history of slavery, genocide, and human rights abuses visited upon peoples of Africa, Asia, the Americas in particular. Within the logic of its rationale, it was used to establish the idea of a biological hierarchy to explain differences between human beings. In so doing, the idea was an attempt to naturalize a specific set of power relations and cultural differentiations. As such, not only was slavery and genocide made legitimate, but it became intrinsic to the colonial and imperial status quo, which is central to an idea of being British, and how a notion of Britishness was institutionalized. In this regard, I also want to say the relevance of having a viable definition of race is of little or no importance. What matters is how the institutions of the status quo operate and how they are perpetuated. This is where the question of racism takes root and where the discussion about resistance and film could be put into perspective. And this is really what I would like to talk about. And in so doing, I want to present a number of observations on these subjects in relation to the period, the 1980s to the present. This will involve noting some key moments in the historical presence of African, Caribbean, and Asian communities in Britain during that time. To begin, another clarification. It is important to state that the word film is used generically to refer to the audiovisual media as a whole, cinema, television in particular, and of course, the more recent digital technologies in their various forms. Hence, underlining a very complex scenario both institutionally and culturally. It is also important to acknowledge the diversity that is often masked by categories: African, Caribbean, Asian, or even words like black or white. This is to acknowledge the wider implications of the understanding of core issues, and significantly for appreciating the pivotal role of the media, its representations, and our relationship with it. It therefore needs to be stated that the communities that may be delineated as African Caribbean, for example, have a very different experience of the media to those communities delineated as Asian. We cannot, in fact, take for granted the impact of the long-established legacy of self-representation, industry, and cinema art exemplified by Bollywood and the Indian film industry in general. In so doing, we take note of the complex and varied experiences of racism and the various modes of resistance and choices which filmmakers, audiences, and communities have made and continue to make. And this is very important. These differentiations and accepting, recognizing difference and different experiences and cultural specificity of various communities. On my part, it is not accidental, I think, that my presence here on this occasion has much to do with the compilation of archive film entitled Big City Stories. This is the work of the Black London's Film Heritage Project, curated by myself and June Giovanni for Film London in 2011, completed last year around April. You may have heard of this compilation. It's available. And the intention of it was to provide an archive compilation of film footage that presents a narrative of the change in lives and the change in perceptions of Black Londoners in their place, as their place was established among the city's diverse cultures and communities in the 20th century. Its focuses on London looks specifically at the African and Caribbean communities, how they have been perceived and represented as inhabitants of London during that period. Now, in approaching this project, 3 questions immediately presented themselves to us. The first was, what story did we want to tell? The second was, what story can we tell? What story can be told by virtue of the material which we researched? And thirdly, how would that story be perceived, not only by an audience of contemporary Londoners, but importantly, an audience of the future? The underlying definitive factor here is the need to tell a story. That's very important, the need to tell a story, and equally having a story to tell. While there might be workable answers to those questions which I mentioned, the last question has to be left to the future. Even so, that is as much as we might know at this moment. Its outcome, however, should be an issue for concern. We had to be in some way concerned with that particular question in even a limited sense. This suggests another crucial factor about film and the media as a whole. Essentially, it concerns the fact that the media provides materials which greatly impact upon the perceptions which we form of ourselves and others, even within the same society, and in relation to individuals, groups, institutions, and even events. It provides a substantial amount of the knowledge which individuals claim to know, as opposed to knowledge gained from direct experience. The critical function of the media as a producer, reproducer, and disseminator of knowledge is inescapable. It is here that the crucial question, or is here in a crucial sense, racism finds its potency. It is here that we find the significance of Frantz Fanon's observations, and he makes these observations in his book, collections of writings published under the title Towards the African Revolution. There's an essay, Racism and Culture, in which he says, or he asks us to consider, that racism bloats and disfigures the face of the culture that practices it. Literature, the plastic arts, songs for shop girls, proverbs, habits, patterns, whether they set out to attack it or vulgarize it, restore racism. This means that a social group, a country, a civilization cannot be unconsciously racist. Cannot be unconsciously racist. In this regard, the issue seems to be how racism is managed and the kinds of evident modes of resistance which contest its manifestations and its processes. I will note, as I said, the 1980s, which are effectively marked by the urban uprisings of 1981, so-called Brixton riots, and at the end of that decade, the Satanic Verses controversy of 1989. In relation to the 90s period and beyond, I will, in the background underlying reference, note the Runnymede report on Islamophobia, published in 1997. It was termed Islamophobia, a challenge for us all, And I will use this as a marker of a reframed perspective on institutional racism. How did we arrive at the 1980s? Well, in the widespread discourses of the media up to that time, quite simply, black people in Britain were a problem. We arrived, they call them the Windrush generation or whatever you want to refer to them, and immediately became a problem. And the media debated that presence consistently as problematic or a problematic intrusion in British society on all levels. As the 80s dawned, a new British-born generation, more alienated and disenfranchised than their immigrant parents and perhaps older siblings, made their outrage felt. In my film, made in 1981, Riots and Rumors of Riots, I tried to put this into perspective. In so doing, the film went some way towards validating the traditions of independence in culture and social organization that were embedded in the experience of the African Caribbean community. It also opened up a view on the traditions of political activism around discrimination, immigration legislation, education, and in the workplace. This culture of resistance has been more comprehensively discussed in the various publications about the post-war presence of migrants in Britain. And I'm sure you are familiar with those publications by various writers. It also documents or engages with, on the flip side, if you want to read it another way, the building of black communities and establishment of black communities over those decades. Collectively, on the broad frame, these traditions of independence, which exist not only in the African Caribbean community, but also within the Asian communities, can be seen as resources that provided the means for the African Caribbean and Asian filmmakers and media workers of the 80s for the means by which they could take advantage of opportunities that arose from the fundamental shifts in the British film and television industry at the beginning of the 1980s. And here I want to screen you 3 minutes from a film, Blood I Go Run, which was made in 1981, which I would propose exemplifies this tradition of independence. That's just a section of the film. And the reason I wanted to play this film, made in 1981, is because it exemplifies, as I said, the tradition of independence in black filmmaking in Britain. It was made by a group of filmmakers, including Menelik Shabazz and myself, who went on to be among the founders of Chedo Film and Video Workshop in 1982. The film is a reportage of the Black People's Day of Action, organized in London to express the outrage felt about the racist indifference that followed the fire in New Cross that killed 13 young black people attending a birthday party. In 1982, this film being made in 1981, in 1982, Channel 4 comes on stream and marks a fundamental transformation in the institutional relations of British television and film industry. With this came the recognition or a recognition of diversity within the notion of the British nation and a mainstream role for independent filmmakers. That was accommodated by an agreement known as the Grant-Aided Workshop Production Declaration. It was an agreement between the Industries Union, the ACTT, the British Film Institute, and Channel 4, and provided a formal basis for non-commercial and community-based units to legitimately have a space within the established media landscape. In this context, the interventions of filmmakers from the African, Caribbean, and Asian communities precipitated a specific politics of representation. It took the form of productions and a range of practices defined through the work of Chedo Film and Video, Black Audio Film Collective, Sankofa Film Collective, and Retake Film and Video Collective, collectively known as the Black Workshops. This work was being produced parallel to programs such as the current affairs BBC program Ebony, Channel 4's Eastern Eye, Black on Black, The Bandung File, and sitcoms like No Problem, and of course later, The Real McCoy on the BBC. Importantly, the work and practice of independent filmmakers of this period may be contextualized by a number of debates and critical ideas. Frantz Fanon, mentioned earlier, was of fundamental significance. Fanon, a psychologist born in Martinique in the Caribbean, is acknowledged as a seminal figure in the theorizing of anti-racist strategies. His writings provide a foundational perspective on anti-colonial struggles, providing critical insight into the significance of culture and issues of nationalism. These ideas were influential in shaping the ideas that were being developed to articulate the Black presence in Britain from the perspective of those communities. In particular, the writings and ideas on identity, diaspora, and nationhood articulated by Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, and Homi Bhabha were definitive in engaging with the issues of resistance and the media. Now, whatever the perceptions and the critical responses to the body of ideas which these thinkers represent, they help to define the moment of the 1980s. A moment when, for the first time, Britain was made to confront its colonial and imperial history from the perspective of the colonized in its midst. In the decades that followed, and with the Workshop Declaration now redundant, a new media politics was observed following the Satanic Verses affair in 1989. This controversy around the publication of Salman Rushdie's novel capitulated the British Muslim community in all its diversity and complexity into a global, self-serving politics in which the discourse of race and its ideology of racism was transposed into a rhetoric which made Islamophobia more possible and very useful. Here, the role of the media in neutralizing and demonizing legitimate legitimate protests is instructive. Equally so is the institutional politics of the race industry or the race relations industry. If we were to scan the ideas of Hall, Gilroy, and Bhabha, for example, it can be understood that this politics thrives on a reductive and one-dimensional them and us discourse, against which Homi Bhabha has argued for a third space. It can be argued that where the 1980s opened up the possibility of such a space, what was to follow blew it all away. The Satanic Verses of Fear involved the distillation of global politics into the established media institutions in a way that mobilizes the discourse of racism in the interests of claims to defend democracy. In spite of Britain being a society in which burning things as a form of protest was not new, there was a flood of bigoted responses from the publishing and political establishment who saw the eventual display of rage enacted in the burning of the book as an affront to all that they were mandated to uphold and defend. Free speech, as the Levson Inquiry has now conveniently reminded Britain in 2012, is not unconditional, neither is it absolute. In his study of the Rushdie affair and the British press, a publication by Bikku Paresh in 1990, it's titled The Rushdie Affair and the British Press, Some Salutary Lessons. Paresh took issue with Muslim leaders for their handling of the affair. He also noted the bigoted and racist responses of the British media. He commented, rather than stimulating a reasoned discussion of their grievances as they had naively hoped, the book burning incident led to a torrent of denunciation. Muslims were called barbarians, uncivilized, fanatics, and compared to Nazis. Many a writer, some of impeccable liberal credentials, openly wondered how Britain could civilize them and protect their innocent progeny against their parents' medieval fundamentalism. Now, these observations illustrate the climate of the new politics of representation evident from the 90s. This is the era of diaspora and transnational media, the era of globalization and global politics which operates locally as well as on a global basis. Here, the film My Son the Fanatic, made in 1997, is instructive. Around that time, I had the opportunity to speak on Islam and the cinema in Britain at an event for the Royal Commonwealth Society, a conference or symposium series called Mutualities Islam in Britain. My review of the film was recalled stating, within the context of the film, there were quite serious social and political issues begging to be explored. But as I observed at the time, this was not the agenda of the film. Instead, what was presented was the idea that Islam was the religion and the preoccupation of the backward, the alien, and the intruder, usually from the Indian subcontinent, who was threatening the social fabric. Together with the overall media output, and I include Hollywood films as well, this film could be seen to contribute to a discourse concerning the presence and treatment of communities designated as problematic, un-British, un-American, alien, and therefore worthy of elimination. From the 1990s, the urgency of Baba's propagation for a third space is probably even more an urgent consideration. This concept stresses hybridity and an engagement with cultural difference, as opposed to the sterile multicultural politics of cultural diversity. It propagates a move away from essentialism and the implicit acceptance of natural superiority of certain identities. It foregrounds the universal and perpetual process of culture, all cultures for that matter, as an ongoing process of negotiation and incorporation and change. The third space in this sense is a location for equitable exchange, communication, and transformation. As a location of cultural production, it could be conceived as an open space for the creative thinker or for creative thinking, one that facilitates critical engagement with ideas and issues. What does this all mean against the background of the Runnymede Trust's report of 1997, Islamophobia, a challenge for us all? What does it all mean in terms of the Macpherson report of 1999 on the Stephen Lawrence inquiry? And indeed, what does it mean for us now in the light of the Leveson report of 2012? An inquiry into the practice and ethics of the press. It is here in the present day that we might contemplate or evaluate the media and its social role in relation to a substantial segment of the public. With reference to the African Caribbean community, what can clearly be established is the specific experience within and across that community. Digital media and relatively recent television options such as BET and Voice of Africa Television, along with the Nigerian Nollywood phenomenon, have been extremely significant in reconceptualizing or reconfiguring the power relations within the media. However, within the established and public broadcasting institutions, there is still disturbing practices. Colin Prescott of the Institute of Race Relations remarked in 2004, while there is a hunger for serious black public broadcasting, what we get instead is diversity management. He was commenting on the sacking of a BBC radio presenter because he was too intellectual for the station. In his terms, the work, Prescott that is, the work of specifically African Caribbean film and program makers in the broadcasting media is nothing more than a contrivance to manage a sort of intrusion under the label of multiculturalism or diversity. Cynical, perhaps, but what evidence do we have to the contrary? Taking a wider spectrum, let us consider the films of the last decade or so. Bullet Boy, Saul Dib, 2004, Kidulthood, Menage Huda, 2006, Brick Lane, Sarah Gravon, 2007, Adulthood, Noel Clarke, One Day, Penny Woodcock, 2009, BBC series Small Island, and more recently from the Asian perspective, Citizen Khan. I don't know if anybody has seen it. It's unavoidable. It's there. BBC, you pay your license to see it. But it seems like something dug out of the dungeon of the 1970s, as far as I'm concerned. In conclusion, I would like to reframe the question which June Giovanni and myself confronted in producing Big City Stories, and contemplate what does this mean in relation to the cursory list which I have just outlined. The same questions can also be posed in relation to the recent work of two African Caribbean directors I'd like to mention, as a way of providing at least a reference point. Here I want to mention The Story of Lover's Rock by Menelik Shabazz in 2011, and Mirror Boy, produced by Obi Emelonye in 2011. I don't know if anybody's familiar with those titles, but they are very important films, I think, that have come out in the last 2 years. The questions. What stories do we want to tell? What stories can be told? And how would those stories be perceived in the future? The central concern here, as I would repeat, is the perpetual politics of representation. And more importantly, or intrinsically, the need to tell stories. Above that, not only there's a need, but there's an importance of telling our own story, however that is conceived, however the hour is conceived. The story has to be told. And ultimately, the kind of legacy that will hold us accountable to future generations. Thank you.
Plenty of food for thought. Can I invite our panelists to come and join Imru up here? Okay, so we've got a fantastic panel who are going to extend this discussion. Next to Imru, who you've already heard from, is Riz Ahmed. So since Riz's screen debut in 2005, he starred in award-winning films and TV, including Michael Winterbottom's Road to Guantanamo, Ill Manners, and Chris Morris's critically acclaimed debut feature, Four Lions. Riz also makes sonically innovative and lyrically sharp music. His 2006 debut single, The Post 9/11 Blues, created frenzy across TV, radio, and newsprint. Next to Riz is Warren Nettleford. Warren's a BBC News London reporter and has been working in television for the past 6 years, and also spent a year working in making documentaries. During that time, he's worked abroad, worked on national news programmes, and reported on some of the country's major news stories. He's gained significant experience in reporting and producing news programmes. Next to Riz is Himesh Patel. Himesh began his career in the BBC soap EastEnders as Tanwar Masood. He also appears in the 2010 spin-off series EastEnders E20 and has co-written an episode of EastEnders E20. And finally, Victoria Ije. Victoria is a young filmmaker who was involved with the BFI Future Film Project at the beginning of her career. She now has an MA in producing film and TV and has made several short films and documentaries, including the award-winning Sickle Cell, aired on BBC Two. Let's welcome our panel. So there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. If you are on Twitter, do use the hashtag and see if we can get the conversation going there as well. But I want to start asking the panel, what have they seen on TV or in film recently which they think is an unhelpful representation of minority communities? And what have they seen that's more positive? Riz, I'm going to start with you. Oh, actually, Warren, you've got the mic in your hand.
I'll go on.
Oh, no, go on, Riz, I'll start with you then. Oh, but they need to...
Oh, I turned it on. Hello. So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of unhelpful representation of minority communities, I think, in the news, if I'm honest. I think there's a lot of underrepresentation of minority communities in fictional media, and I think there's a lot of negative representation or disproportionately negative representation in factual media. That's kind of where I would go. I don't think there's a lot of negative representation in fictional media anymore. I think we kind of grew up through that, and I think there was a lot of that even, I think, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I think that we're kind of coming out of a kind of a period of having a lot of kind of, for example, negative portrayals of like Muslim characters, a lot of post 9/11 storylines that kind of reinforce stereotypes rather than necessarily subverting them, which is a lot of the work that I've kind of, or at least I see myself as having been involved in. I'd be interested to hear from people who may disagree with that. I think that, yes, that's kind of where I see it. I think there's there's probably too many conversations about minorities in factual media and not enough in fictional.
Warren, what do you think, given...
All right, so, hello. So I work in news, I'm a journalist. So I'm partly responsible, I suppose, for the problem. When it comes to the representation of black or minority ethnic groups in the media, I'll put something out there by saying often it's easy to say the media are to blame or the news is to blame, because more often than not, when you see a news story, it's something special which has happened or something which is significant. And so if there is a black person attached to that story, then I think maybe it's unduly kind of puts the perception that perhaps, the news media are, in television anyway, are representing black people in a certain light. Now, I've worked in newsrooms for the past 6 years or so, and obviously there are instances where you are dealing with very sensitive stories or sensitive court cases or issues which, involve a black person in the story. And what I would say is often, because newsrooms aren't particularly diverse even to this day, where I work, there is perhaps an extra onus on people who have experience or have a knowledge or an understanding of different communities to make sure that their take or their understanding of the issues is represented in the stories. And when I say represented in the stories, in terms of making sure they go to the right people, or ensuring that, say, for instance, if you're doing a story about, a young Muslim person, man or a girl, that you don't just go for the person who would give you the most sensational kind of line. So it's about achieving that kind of balance. In terms of what I've seen in the news, I'd say, sorry, I'm being quite airy-fairy. It's a bit different with papers, I'd say, than it is with television news. In my opinion, there's definitely, I'd say, papers like the Daily Mail, I think, are often irresponsible in terms of what they do But then again, everybody likes reading the Daily Mail. People forget that in what they do. But I forgot the second part of the question. I'm very sorry. You asked me what I'd seen, which is good. What I like? Right. It's kind of a bit of a cliche, but I did like Top Boy last year. Now, I know it does reinforce a particular stereotype in terms of, gritty urban drama, and I do think in some ways it's a bit of a shame that we are kind of still doing that kind of program and saying that's kind of definitely representative of what the Black British experience is. But as a drama on its own right, I thought it was good. And I think there should be a differentiation between saying that's a good drama, but at the same time saying, right, what we do need as well is we need to see other good dramas showing different parts of the Black British experience at the same time. Sorry, long.
So, Himesh, no one's mentioned EastEnders yet, which I think is a little bit harsh. What have you seen that you think is a good representation, and what's less helpful?
I just ummed without the microphone, so I'm going to with the microphone. I think what's good to see, I mean, obviously what you guys have said is true. In the media, there's some very negative representations, especially in the print media, in certain print media, like the one that you mentioned. But what's good to see is more sort of people tackling the issues as to why people do things that you'd associate with certain ethnic groups, things that you see in the news all the time. I think what's good that the fictional media is doing is telling those stories and telling the stories of why people do what they do and what's the reasoning behind it, and stuff like, well, Brits, that Riz did, which I only managed to watch last year, but it was a really good show, to be honest with you, on a simple level, but it gave people an insight into what drives people to do certain things, and I think that's a positive thing, is helping people understand, because certain ignorance comes from a lack of understanding, and I think it's a power that the media has to help people understand.
I'm going to have to lean into the microphone for this. Two main programs kind of jumped to mind when asked this question. Attack the Block, I thought I quite really enjoyed that, and initially on the front of it, it did seem to take and conform to the general stereotypes, but by the end of the film, I'm not sure if everyone has watched it, but by the end of the film you do feel like you understand why these characters, like you said, got to this point, and the fact that at the end of the day it's a community. And another film is My Brother the Devil, which is just been recently released by director Sally El Hussein. And that film, again, much like Attack the Block, takes the initial concept of being another urban hood film, and then the journey that the characters take leads them away from that path. And in relation to the last film, it's quite ironic because in the production of that film, to get it made, the startup was quite hard. I remember in a discussion I had with her, she said that it was quite, no one would fund her. None of the conventional forms of BBC, Channel 4, or the BFI would actually fund that film. And at the end of the day, she had to go to private funders to actually get that film made. So,
yeah. You asked the question in your presentation, what stories do we want to tell? How did you answer that?
In a very broad sense, we want to tell stories that validate us as humans and our experience. We want to tell stories that take account or testimony to our presence here, wherever we are, whether it's Britain or the East End or wherever you want to locate yourself. We have to tell stories that locate us, we talk about Britain, within British society. That's the first thing. And validate us as human beings. That's a very tricky issue, because you can enjoy a depiction or a story that is a stereotype. It's possible. You can enjoy negative representations. You can enjoy a drama can be good, but yet neutralizes your cultural presence, your presence as a person, as an individual. And it could still be fantastic. It doesn't account for you being here in the 21st century or the 20th century. So that's the kind of stories we want to tell. And that's the way I evaluate whatever I might see, whether it's Bullet Boy, the film you mentioned, My Brother the Devil, or anything on television. How does it speak to that presence of a Britain which is diverse and essentially living people who have come with a history and legacies of for eternity? The other question about what stories can you tell is also now contingent upon the institutional factors. In our case, it was about the archive footage that existed and what we could get access to. But here it's about the institutional factors that then say, we will fund this, we will not fund this, or we will distribute this, or we will not distribute that. That becomes the other kind of process.
So let's think a bit about some of the structures, because it, as a career, we've got great experience on this panel. What are some of the challenges that people of colour might face in the media industries, and what kind of opportunities are there within that? Victoria, maybe you can start. What do you think some of the challenges are?
I remember I was talking to a few people today, and I was saying that I was on a shoot 2 weeks ago, and it was a crew of 50 in total, and out of the 50 there was only 5 women and there was 1 black person, and that black person was me. So that right there is the kind of difficulties we face. We're trying to get into basically the production, being people behind the camera that makes the films, make the TV programs that get shown.
Just before we talk about those structures, I just wanted to pick up on a point you were making here about kind of what stories we want to tell. I just think that's a wonderful point to make, which is about humanizing characters, portraying 3-dimensional characters when they're minorities. I think we'd be really misguided if we want every portrayal or of a black story or of an Asian story to be representative of that group's experience. I think sometimes we get bogged down in that. I mean, it's really interesting, actually, and it's a very natural reaction. I remember, when East is East first came out, we thought, on the one hand, amazing, East is East, Pakistani characters. But on the other hand, we were really pissed off because we were like, why is the dad, beating the kids? They're saying that all Asian dads beat kids. But that's actually a very misguided way of thinking about it, but it's a very natural instinct because you don't see other Asian dads on TV. So one Asian dad becomes the archetypal Asian dad. And actually, rather than it being about, hang on a minute, in Bullet Boy, why are they all drug dealers? If they're 3-dimensional characters, we will relate to them, we'll invest in them, and that's part of the humanizing process. The problem just becomes that there aren't enough ethnic minorities on screen. And that's why every time you see a brown or a black face, it's like we want to project all our story onto them. We want that black face to represent the entire black story. We want that black, and so it's just about getting lots of people out there. So as much as we talk about Top Boy and we talk about, stories that very much focus on ethnic minorities, I think it's really important to talk about Adrian Lester in Hustle. I think it's really important to talk about, Naomi Harris in Skyfall. And just those moments where it's just a person, it's just a human being, and it doesn't talk about locating their legacy and their history in 21st century Britain in a multicultural context. It's just a person and they're a human, and I think that's the holy grail for us to get to.
Well, I'm not actually. I hear what you're saying, but I have to disagree a little bit because you see, I can tell an American film. You look at an American film with all white characters, and I understand an American cultural and ideological context. You put a black character in there from another, whether it's African American or black British or what, you don't see that context change. That person is incorporated and their history is neutralized within the text. That's what I'm saying. In Hustle, there's no idea who this black guy is. Where is he coming from? The other characters, I can see who they are.
Do you not think that
I can
do you not think that you may be holding the black characters to a different standard then?
No. I'm talking about the way the text works, the way the media works.
I'm talking about a program.
I'm talking about the way characters are displaced within a landscape of a drama. Yes? Okay, you can say this is a certain kind of black person who is middle class and living in a white world. That's reasonably enough. And we can accept that. But I don't see characters that come into, I walk into an office, I know my personality changes that office. And no black person can tell me that doesn't happen. You come into an environment, you speak different, you walk different, you make a difference. I am talking about that, the human difference that I talk about, right? Unless we understand diversity, difference, it's not diversity now. We're talking about differences, cultural differences, which is character, is part of character. Then we are not really getting to grips with what it means to have a society where everybody is not the same. That's what I'm talking about.
Just get a different perspective on this. I mean, Himesh,
And I'm not saying we have to speak for the community all the time. No, I just want to clarify that.
I think we basically
I don't
agree
want to, I'm
broadly.
not interested in that at all. No.
Himesh, want to come to you as an actor, career in front of you, colorblind casting. If someone was to ask you to play Sherlock after Benedict Cumberbatch,
One can dream.
hey, but still, do you think that could work? Do you think we can actually get to stage on the media where we've got actually colorblind casting in that?
I kind of hope that within my lifetime that happens, but I don't want it to be a thing. You know, it's got to be. He's just an actor. It doesn't necessarily mean he's an Asian actor, or he's just an actor, and he should be as valid as the next guy who's not Asian, who's not black. You know, God knows I'd love to play Sherlock. I don't know whether I'd do it any justice, and I wouldn't actually want to in the wake of Benedict Cumberbatch. But yeah, I'd like to see at some point it just being a thing. I don't want it to, as in I don't want to be a thing at all. I want it to just be who's the next guy, and for the colour of their skin to not be an issue at all. But that, I mean, maybe wishful thinking, but.
Do you think, Warren, that newsrooms will get to that point where you won't be a black reporter, you'll be just a reporter, or do you think they've already got to that stage?
You guys are way ahead in lots of ways. If you look at those BBC newsreaders, they're very diverse, disproportionately diverse to the general population.
Yeah, well, it depends. It depends how you look at it. I mean, in terms of the diversity at, say, at the BBC, for instance, you could argue that there are a disproportionate amount of female Asian.
We need to
newsreaders.
stop it. It's a problem.
Yeah, it's not a. Yeah, you know, you could argue that there are lots of Asian reporters or newsreaders, and there aren't any black male reporters. Not very many anyway that I know of at the BBC. But in terms of, I'll go back just to making the programs and the difficulties there. When it comes to commissioning a program, say you go to the BBC, you go to Channel 4, and their main priority obviously is audiences and to make sure that people watch the programs. And they're obviously then going to be risk averse, the commissioners, because they want to make sure that they're watched. And so I think there's a situation right now in television where commissioners aren't being risk averse enough, are being too risk averse, sorry, not taking risks. And so I'll give you the example of Peep Show. People here know that show, Peep Show. I think it's very funny. I like it quite a lot. But you'd be surprised, and it actually only gets about 1.5, 1.6 million viewers, Peep Show, which is quite a series which has gone for 8 years now. 8 series, but 1.5 million. And I pretty much am certain that if there was another show which, say, had a all-black cast, which only got, say, 1.1, 1.2 million, it'd be canned after one series. Because they'd say, oh, no one's watching it, it's not really important, let's get rid of it. But because Peep Show kind of ticks boxes in terms of where the actors studied or where, who they're talking to in terms of, middle class kind of people in their mid-20s, urbanised, working big cities, it kind of means it ticks boxes, and so programs like Peep Show get recommissioned. And good, because I like it. But what I'm saying is they need to be more risk-taking, when it comes to other kind of black minority ethnic programming. But by the same token, I don't think it's a case where you want to ghettoise and just say, oh, we're making black programs for black people with only black casts. I think it'd be interesting if there was a program which was all black. I'd be intrigued to say it worked if it was a good story. And that's the thing, it has to be about good stories and good drama and just generally good television programs, rather than thinking in kind of like racial terms. If there's a good program, like say, 20 years ago, Desmond was great, that wouldn't work now. A program like Desmond's wouldn't work now as it worked 20 years ago because the country's changed so much. But what I think is important is that basically commissioners take risks.
You mentioned a range of programs, so Ebony, Black on Black. There was a whole series on Channel 4 and BBC2 of programs that were Eastern Eye, kind of aimed at particular communities. Those have all disappeared. Why do you think that is? Are they just not good television?
Not necessarily. I think one, the sort of rationale with that brought them into being became outmoded, and television changed. And it changed under the pretext of incorporating everybody into a mainstream. And really what that meant is disappearing people, which is really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the way you get incorporated and then disappeared. I'm not interested in black programs for the sake of black programs. I am not interested in all black casts for the sake of all black casts. I talked about presence, a human presence. Now, how then with the demise of Black on Black, which served the purpose, and we critiqued in significant ways, because we had issues with those programs in the way they ghettoized certain ideas about our presence here, black people's presence generally. They have gone. What has taken their place? We have the marginalized. I've been out of this country for about 10 years, and I come back and I can't recognize television or Britain. Young people are telling me about problems, young filmmakers, that I thought I had 30 years ago. So where have we gone? We don't have that. Yes, we have no news reporters, but we still have the quality of news and current affairs, which marginalizes African, Caribbean, Asian communities to a great degree. There's still contentions there. So that's not the issue. And I don't want to talk about news specifically. That's a very specific idea. News is news. What happens is news. We're talking about the wider perspective of the media and its processes and the way Britain and British institutions manage what Colin Prescott calls diversity. That's the issue.
To continue on from what you're saying, I suppose the presence now of where everyone's going to is the internet, because they can't get their stuff, their voices, whatever they want made in film or on TV. Everyone's now transferred to the internet, and everyone's growing presence is there now.
That has created, like I said, the new media has reconfigured the environment, but there are still very important issues about power and access and meaning within that landscape. I think black people are still, to a great degree, marginalized on the internet, and to a great degree. Yes, I am told that if you have a Twitter account or something and 100 people are following you, then you're famous. That's interesting. I don't have a Twitter account. I'm just learning to use SMS,
I want to give the audience a chance to ask questions. So let's take it in groups of 3, let's say, and there are helpfully 2 down here and then 1 in the front row. So this gentleman here in the tie, and then Adam in front of him. So keep your hand up, and they won't be able to see.
I don't want to be too greedy, but firstly I wanted to speak to Riz, just a quick statement about Naomi Harris. I think it's right that it's good to celebrate a black character in a film with no reference to race at all. But I do wonder in that case how much that is the institution behind Bond putting a black character in a position of power as a response to criticism that they didn't have any black characters in those positions in previous Bond films, in the same way they had a woman take on the character of M. So I wonder in that particular case if there was some of that in it. But I do want to talk about new media and the complexities with Twitter and everybody having their say. And when there has been an incident in sport or an incident of racism in the news, when it's not just journalists, not just the television getting their say, but anyone. And the backlash of anybody bringing up and talking about things like reverse racism and creating a backlash of racism which is allowed to grow and fester? And is that one of the problems of new media?
I wanted. Is this on? I wanted to ask about. I remember seeing a bit of Top Boy as well, and I remember it being compared quite a lot to The Wire, and I thought that was quite problematic because one thing I thought about when I saw Top Boy was, where's the police? The black people just walk around trying to make money and doing and they say business on their estate, and there's no police. The one thing The Wire did was, yeah, the police spend all day trying to stop black people from selling drugs, and they're all violent alcoholics. Like, this is like one of the most important parts of the program, and what it did was problematize structural racism and structural inequality and state racism. Do you think that, like, seeing as the BBC is a kind of a state organisation, that it's likely that these forms of racism and inequality, which a lot of black people, or which all black people have to live and operate in, will be addressed in the same way as it has in parts of US programming?
So there's a question about new media and some of the dangers as well as some of the opportunities in new media, and it's useful to think about both sides of that. And a point about The Wire, effectively, and whether that's whether we're getting a fair representation of structural racism on television, or is it just all about personal race? Is that your taking? Right. Okay.
Just to respond to the very first point, if people are doing good things for bad reasons, then I'd rather that than they just do bad things for bad reasons, or bad things even for good reasons. I think if they've been responding to some kind of pressure that they feel unrepresentative and they're trying to take some steps towards that, it may be slightly contrived in their motivations to begin with, but you know, those are baby steps getting to where we want to get to. And also, I feel like I didn't feel it really like it was contrived. I mean, I completely bought it. I know there's a kind of argument about her being deracinated and not taking in her kind of cultural heritage in the character, but I didn't really feel like, you know, as a spy, they wouldn't really go into her backstory, so I totally bought it. And Idris Elba, they want Idris to be Bond, and he's probably not going to do it. So, you know, that's I think that we have kind of got, you know, come forwards in that sense. New media-wise, I think that the fragmentation of the media landscape is actually a big reason why we don't have programs like Eastern Eye, Desi DNA, and The Real McCoy on TV anymore, because you've got the Islam channel, you've got ZTV, you've got Geo, you've got, I'm only naming the Asian ones because that's what my parents watch, but you've got a big, yeah, I watch them too a bit, but you've got that fragmentation, which maybe you could say is like, okay, hang on a minute, we've disappeared people from the mainstream. But I'd wonder whether we ask a question, is going back to what Victoria was saying, is like, how much weight should we place on this mainstream anymore? These 4 traditional terrestrial channels that used to be there, when they combine viewership, you know, against maybe a lot of what used to be seen as niche channels, with now cable channels, maybe doesn't compare, doesn't even weigh up. So I don't know. If people are disappearing in some places, they're appearing in others as well. In terms of about The Wire, I think it's an issue of ownership of story and frankly budgets as well. I know the guy who wrote Top Boy, he spent years just going out there on his own, interviewing kids on estates for years. He did his research, but he didn't have the budget to have a team of like 15, 20 people like the guys in The Wire did to go out there and speak to them and speak to police and speak to everyone. He had to go and do that on his jacks without Film 4 writing him checks to have a whole team behind him. So that's to do with budgets. And secondly, ownership of story. That wasn't written by a young black male. Yeah, he was an Irish middle-aged man. And he's done his best, but ultimately, in terms of things being bang on the money, it won't be bang on the money until people are making stories about what they really intimately know. Not to ghettoize it and say that only black people should make stories about black people. I think that's dangerous. But I think it's an issue about ownership and about budgets there.
Warren, you've got any response to either of those?
Okay, great. I'll start with Naomi Harris. I think Riz kind of answered that already, basically, but I'll add. It's about judging her again by a different kind of standard, because when I saw her in 28 Days Later, I didn't really think about, you know, her necessarily, her kind of abandoning some of her cultural heritage at all in that role. I just saw her as being an excellent black actress who was fantastic in the role. And I think the fact that she became to be Moneypenny people have already got a perception as to what Moneypenny is like and what her role is in the 50 years of the Bond franchise. So to completely change that around, I think it wouldn't really work, and I just think it was right for the film. When it comes to Top Boy, also there are loads of dramas where sometimes you don't touch on every single aspect of the story, and so yeah, it was to do with the budgets, and so I can see why they left them out. And when it comes to an idea of structural racism at the BBC or at Channel 4 or at any of the other kind of major broadcasters, I wouldn't say that often it's kind of the it's. I think it's quite difficult to talk about structural racism sometimes in big monolithic organisations like the BBC, because sometimes it's very hard to see the wood from the trees. And I just talk about personal experiences and what I know from the departments I've worked in. And I'd say that yes, there are problems, but yes, they are trying to resolve some of them. But going back to that idea of structural racism, and it's not just about racism; it's also about class too. I'll give you an example. When I did my masters in journalism, when I studied for it, there were 25 in my class, and out of the 25, there were, I think, 22 of us who either went to private school or Oxford or Cambridge. And those are all the people, that was 6 years ago, who are now doing what I do at the BBC or at Channel 4 or making programmes. So that kind of gives you an idea as to what it's like. And of those, there were 2 of us who were black and 2 Asian, and one of them is Asian, not working TV anymore. So that kind of gives you some kind of idea as to breaking down barriers and how it's also to do with class and not just to do with race.
Don't have a lot to add, but about the Naomi Harris Skyfall business. I mean, spoiler alert about Moneypenny, by the way. But the fact that she became, at no point when that happened did I go, oh, so it's a black Moneypenny. It was just, wow, cool. So she's Moneypenny. And that's what I was talking about earlier when you asked me about Sherlock as an example. The fact that it's not a thing. It's just, she's Moneypenny. It doesn't matter about what she looks like or the fact that she's a black actress or anything like that. And I think it's a positive step, obviously. And she's hot, right? So that helps. But yeah, so obviously whether they were doing it for the right intentions or not, I don't know. I mean, unless you sit down with Barbara Broccoli, I guess we won't really know. But it's a good step, and they didn't make a big deal of it. It didn't. It was just, it was a positive thing and understated, I think. So.
New media, though. Given your work on E20, which was online as well as...
Online, and they showed it at some ridiculous hour on BBC Two, yeah.
But do you think there are opportunities in new media that people should be capitalising on, which might give us a rounder representation of the British public?
Yeah, I mean, the internet is huge. I mean, Victoria mentioned it earlier, and I think stuff like E20 is really, really positive. I mean, I don't know if we've been commissioned for a 4th series or not. I don't know, but it was really positive, and I mean, it would have been nice to maybe have an Asian character in there, but I don't know why. It just would have been maybe because I wanted to do a bit more acting. I don't know. But no, it was good, and it was good to work on something like that where it was giving. I mean, this moves beyond race really. It was just a sort of an age thing, so giving young people an opportunity, because most of the writers were around my age, maybe a little older, maybe a little younger, and it was an opportunity for us to give. To put stories out there that we wanted to tell, and yeah, so there are stories to tell, and there's new formats to tell it in, and there are a lot of people who will find it on the internet and they'll watch it. For example, I haven't had a TV for 6 months because I've moved into a new place. I've lived without a TV. I've managed to watch everything online, and along with everything that is also aired on TV, I've watched a lot of stuff that's not aired on TV over here. So there are people out there, and it's easy to access stuff that you'll only be able to watch online. And so I think it's important that people take the initiative of shooting stuff and putting it out there on the internet rather than on TV.
Just to add to that, I think it's great the internet and social media and how people can now go off and make their own films and their own dramas and whatever. But I think we shouldn't let the big broadcasters off the hook by saying, oh, well, they can go off on the internet and do their own thing, and it's not for us, these guys can go and do it themselves. If anything, I think young filmmakers and people who have got their own ideas should use the internet as another opportunity to go and say, look, we are really passionate about this. We've done all the hard work. We've gone and made a pilot on our own. done all this work. Now take a look and see what we can achieve. And if we have you behind us as well, we can go even further. And so I think it's about utilising the internet as a tool in itself to do more and to ensure that there are more opportunities with big broadcasters. It was interesting how Leveson hardly touched the internet in his report, by the way. I think one page in about 400. I think that in itself shows just how complex and how difficult it is to deal with, and how he didn't really have the courage or the time to be bothered to touch it. And social media, I think, can be a great good, but also people can hide behind anonymously and say what they really think can be quite dangerous. And I think it's about realising that that those notions have to be tempered, really.
I don't want to speak for the BBC. That would be too big a task. But I wonder if newsrooms are worried about the internet. Are they worried about BBC's got a duty to speak to the nation, speak under power. If people are watching all their, getting all their content from the media, from the internet, what role is there for the BBC in this?
Well, I think bbc.co.uk is I think it's the biggest or second biggest website in the country in terms of hits. So it's still, we're still really important in terms of the internet, and people do choose to use us to get their news. And by the same token, there are only a few things now where people actually still make an appointment to view, to watch programmes. One of them is big football games, and X Factor, and then news. So I think there's still going to be a role, even when I think in a few years' time, when people think more and more of us will watch TV whenever we like on our own devices, wherever we are, people will still want to see the news and plan their days around it, because in the morning people wake up, listen to 5 Live or the Today programme or Radio 1 and get their news that way. People, when they get home from work, want to watch the news then as well, find out what's going on. Or people will be consuming their news on their phones. So I still think there's a massive role. We're not really worried about it. I think we're embracing it, and I think we are investing even more money now in terms of licence fee and pushing it towards the news. I mean, there are loads of my friends who used to work with me in the newsroom who are now going to work online. I think the only danger is we've got to be still try and stay relevant and ensure that we're not, to, in my mind, BBC, Middle England, home counties, and we're trying to reach out and talk to different audiences at the same time. Interestingly, I think the biggest news website, English-speaking news website in the world right now is dailymail.co.uk. Just so you know.
Great. So, questions. So, let's come to this side. The gentleman in the back row, and then we'll take... Oh, there's 2 gentlemen in the back row, and then we'll take these 2 as well. Ask Imri, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, you just have to really speak into it.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to keep my point short, but I think it was like really interesting if we're talking about the BBC and what we expect of them. But it's like, for example, if we look at the Jimmy Savile case and the child molestation that was happening with the Jimmy Savile case, we all took it as something really serious because it involved children. But when we was looking at the case, we realized how long it was going on for. And we were quite shocked that something, a big corporation such as the BBC can allow that to happen for so long. And it's only now to the guy he's actually dead, now that we're actually looking at the case and seeing, certain things needs to be changed. I think in terms of comparison, if we're looking at racism within the BBC and what we should hold them accountable for, do we have to wait till a big situation to happen where somebody can have to be in a situation where, they don't get a job or something doesn't happen because of like the race issue? Then do we have to take it on? Do we have to wait for a situation to happen before we have to look at the problem of racism and how the BBC deal with it? So I'm just using that in comparison to the Jimmy Savile case, where it's only till a whistleblower came out, only till she talked about it, and now we're finding out, loads of people knew about it throughout the years. So like, in terms of that, how do you see it, and how do you think we need to address that in terms of racism in the BBC.
Thanks. I'd like to make some few quick points. First of all, I'll say a film is more of a writer's or director's medium. I saw Naomi in a film called The First Grader, and she was great as an African, rather Kenyan teacher. She came across very well as that. Imra, I've got a question for you, because when you started your presentation, you talked about language. But I noticed, apart from one instance where you said African, Caribbean, and Asian, you talked about African Caribbean. And I don't know what that means. To me, African Caribbean are Africans who've got antecedents in the Caribbean. African like me, my antecedents is in Africa, the continent Africa. So I'm not quite sure when you say African Caribbean, what you mean all Africans, irrespective of their antecedents. And then I'm glad that it said race in film, but you've covered what's called news and factual. To me, sometimes a fallacy and the news. I don't know how many are old enough to remember when the liberation struggle in Southern Africa, that means South Africa and Rhodesia. On the news, when the freedom fighters killed, they were called murdered. When the South African forces killed, the word they used was killed. Murder and kill are different. So the news is selective in the words it uses. And one final point, I have an African friend who used to work in the public broadcasting system in the news department. They were told to describe, when they talked about Mugabe, to call him a dictator, and where possible, not to call him a president, not to give him too much credence and respect. That is news, and we call them factual. It's not factual. You use it in a selective way, so there's an agenda. We want diversity, last thing, we want diversity in the newsroom. What if I'm the lone African working, let's say, in the BBC, and I've got this edict that I've got described an African president in that way? If you've not got that support structure, very soon you find that you cannot work in that system. That's why we've got to look at alternatives. I'm not saying don't go into the systems, do go in and out. We should find within and without, but we must be mindful of the realities that how many people are there to support you sometimes? None. Anyway, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
One final. In the middle.
Can you hear me, by the way? Yeah? Yeah?
Up over that, Con.
Right, I'm interested in film criticism. My question is to the lecturer, Imre. In film criticism, there's one of the many schools of thought. There's one that crosses across the line of the idea of naturalism and realism as being a quality in an evaluative sense. I heard one of the panelists mention being bang on the money. So that usually is posited against the idea that good film is that is one that which can imagine a redemptive and better future. So I'm interested in, and I think you also mentioned the idea of validating one's humanity. So I thought that fell under that line, the latter line. And just to give an example of that, I think there's a film being made which is supposed to be about the singer Nina Simone, and the casting in that film is being I think they're casting a lighter skinned actress by the name of Zoe Saldana, which there are ideas of her skin being darkened for the role. So there's even the technicalities of making a film that in order to make it natural, in order to make it look real, resorting to older sort of minstrelsy techniques as well. So just wanted to know what you thought about that.
A wide range of questions, but Victoria, I want to start with you as somebody who's making film. Have you ever been tempted by doing the kind of black costume drama, by getting the kind of the historical lessons and stories of Britain's kind of diverse culture in
with me, in specific reference to the films that I make, I'm a documentary maker and I produce fiction films. So when it comes to me producing films, it's mainly what the director or the writer has brought to me that I take on board. So yeah, in that respect. And then in terms of what the first question was, I think it comes down to the institution of where you're getting your funding from, because at the end of the day, unless you want to not feed yourself for the next year, next 2 years, or however long the film takes to get made, you're going to need someone to fund you for your time, basically. And if no one's willing to fund the film you want to get made, you either have to go to the extreme measures of trying to fund it yourself or change your project to something that will get made. Yeah.
Are there ways of talking about minority ethnic communities' experience that doesn't always have to be focused in on crisis?
I think that's a really interesting question, and now that question's been asked, it does occur to me that often kind of ethnic minorities are seen through the prism of the problems that they posit to society as a whole, and that kind of ties me into the kind of like problematizing of minority communities in the 80s in news media and stuff. I think that is definitely an issue, and it ties into also kind of the first half of the question about there being maybe not as much diversity in the kind of stories that are told about minorities, but I think a lot of that does come back to money. A lot of that comes back to corporations, as you were saying, kind of being risk averse and kind of peddling out old formulas. And really what it takes is someone that sits outside of the system to show that that can work for the people within the system to realize that, hang on a minute, that's a money spinner. And then, a new breed of film starts getting funded. So I do think it's an issue, but I don't know, I kind of feel like maybe I'm being stupid, but I feel positive about all this. I feel like there have been steps, there has been progress, and I feel like it's continuing. It's not going as fast as I'd like to see it happen. And I think, I've just come back from America, and it's really interesting actually seeing the difference of how minorities are portrayed in film and on screen over there compared to here. And if people are interested, we can talk about that more later. But I do think kind of like looking at minorities through the prism of crisis is an issue, but it's one that hopefully is improving.
Where to begin? I think it was in 2001 or 2. Greg Dyke, who was Greg Dyke, who was the Director General of the BBC at the time, said the BBC is hideously white, and at that time, I think around 5 or 6% of staff in the BBC were from black or minority ethnic backgrounds. Things have improved a bit since then, around about 8% now. But in terms of that kind of visible presence, or in terms of those people being in managerial roles, or being editors, or being commissioners, or being senior reporters, there's still obviously a long way to go. So I think we are doing things. I'd say Channel 4 are doing a lot more than the BBC are, in my own experience, in terms of the different diversity schemes they run, or in terms of going to universities and mentoring people too, which I think is really important. Channel 4 have been very good at doing that with their various different talent schemes. If people want to know about those, I'd suggest you go to Channel 4 and find out about them. I'd say yes, like you, Riz, I think I'm optimistic. You have to be, really, because if you're not, then it's kind of deeply depressing. But I think we've got reason to be optimistic in terms of how things are going. One thing you mentioned, which is quite important, which I've now remembered, the use of language. Very emotive. Now, when I remember growing up, I'm from Dudley near Birmingham, and there was a Central News, and there was a story about a guy who was about 25 now, must have been, and it's about stop and search. And he'd been stopped in his car by the police about, I think, no word of lie, more than 30 times. And so he was so angry, he got in touch with the newsroom, and they did a story on him. And the story, I will never ever forget this, because my parents and my aunt and uncle were at the time, and they went ballistic. And the reporter said, and so in his flamboyant car, and his car was a Metro, an orange Metro this guy had. And he'd never been in trouble with the police, had some go faster stripes on it, but because he was a black guy driving around, the police chose to stop him that many times. And just the use of that one word, flamboyant, it kind of just angered people so much. And I am very conscious myself in terms of the use of language that we use in terms of doing news stories. And I think at BBC London anyway, I'm not going to defend us every single time, but I'd say that we're pretty good in terms of ensuring that we are very careful and balanced and fair in the language that we use, because it's so important to get those kind of things right. Flamboyant. Has anyone seen a flamboyant Metro? I just it's just ridiculous.
About realism. I mean, are we expecting too much? I mean, is documentary and news a different thing to fictional basing in media?
That's a very important question you raise, and I think the gentleman here also raised an important question which I want to respond to, and if I wasn't very clear on it. But concerning what you said about naturalism, realism, relates to the discussion which I was very interested in about Naomi Harris and Bond. Bond is a formula. What do you expect from Bond? I mean, come on. Bond is going to be Bond. Bond is a mythic British narrative which perpetuates itself through certain kinds of cultural discourse about Britishness and Britishness in the world. It plays out in the world. Any character that goes into that has to work within that structure. The Black Bond will have to be a very British in the stereotypical sense, in terms of the formulaic sense of Bond, in order to work as a Black Bond. So don't expect the Black Bond is going to bring some radical transformation of the James Bond narrative. In fact, James Bond has always had
what do you want the Black Bond to do?
Yeah,
do you want him to come in like eating jerk chicken and like with dreads? Because the fact is, like, that's stereotyping the Black British experience.
It's not going to happen.
Like, but we don't want that though. But if we did have that, then we'd be very upset about stereotyping it. So I'm just saying that I just think it's worth noting that the benchmark for progress is if we can dent these formulas. And I think it's instructive that the main candidate in line to inherit Bond from Daniel Craig is Idris Elba right now. I think that's worth taking some heart in.
That's not an issue with me, because black people have always been in Bond movies. Have you seen Dr. No? It's full of black people. But not as James Bond. What I'm saying is James Bond is a formula. How that formula responds to the contemporary is really what the outcome is going to be. Why is it now topical to talk about a black James Bond? There must be something else happening in society, whether it's about making money or appealing to audiences, or simply an actor has come up who we think we can mold within that context, right? It's about the way the media works, and it relates to this gentleman's question about the considerations of naturalism and realism. Again, the medium operates around these issues. We are not talking about real. We tend to say things are real. It's all a representation. It's all a fake. Whatever we think of it, it's a construction.
Hang on there. You could turn that around now by saying,
let me finish what I'm saying. Let me finish what I'm saying. Every image you say is it comes through. It's certain decisions. How are we going to represent this character in this narrative? The wider discussion is, what does that narrative relate to? Right. A community, a people, an issue, etc. It's all a construction. We move towards naturalism or realism because of what we know, what we think we know. But in the end, it's all formulaic. It has to work within the structure.
Okay,
that's why I'm saying the media, however, is part of the way we experience life and the way we experience our communities and ourselves. And that's why it becomes critical and important.
That's self-evident, but it's all about outcomes, isn't it? And you could turn this around by saying, in the 80s, the guys in Brixton who were rioting because they were so disenfranchised and so upset and thought they weren't getting these kind of opportunities. Well, 30 years on, there's a situation where, they would have only would have dreamed of where someone who was black could perhaps be seen to be in the role of the foremost, iconic British film role. But you're saying that, that's not maybe a good thing because they wouldn't be black enough.
I didn't say that at all. So I didn't say that. I'm not evaluating it. Let me be clear. I'm not saying Black Bond is good or bad, or Naomi Harris is good or bad. I'm talking about how it works as a myth, a story within the culture.
It's not about naturalism.
It's not, and it brings in this question about we tend to want to relate things to what we think is real. But film works on representation, as you rightly said. Certain tendencies are towards what is natural or Avatar. We say, what are we going to say about Avatar? Are there black people in Avatar? Does it matter, by the way? You know what I mean? What I'm saying is, however, These are this. the, I am not about good or bad. I'm not interested in that. Please let's get to me. I'm saying that if we talk about Bonn in those terms, we are imposing the wrong argument. We are addressing the wrong issues in terms of the institutional structures of racism which work through the media. That's what I'm saying.
I just want to ask Him's question, just about some of the pressures of representation. I mean, you're in the most famous Muslim family in the country, in some sense, right?
I've never said that before, so it's a bit imposing.
But
yeah, right.
What is it that people seem to expect of you, given they've seen you on television as this kind of representative figure of the
They expect me to be exactly like my character, actually. But no, I don't. We've never had much of. Oh, I've never seen much of an expectation, apart from I think when we joined, where people were a bit disappointed with the representation of Asians in. Well, I can only speak for EastEnders. Before and so we came in and I think what was good about the family was we were fairly normal. There wasn't anything much about our ethnicity that was it didn't really factor into the reason we were there. We were just like any other family. We just moved into the square. Fair enough, we owned a post office, which is a fairly Asian stereotype. My parents had a post office at the time as well. But they quickly got rid of that within a year. They'd gotten rid of that. And, what do we do now? We own a restaurant, actually. Yeah. So they're not moving through stereotypes at all. No, I think aside from that, they've actually my characters just started working at a shop again. But apart from that, I think in terms of the characters, my character doesn't. I can speak my own character. He doesn't really. His ethnicity doesn't really filter into a lot of his storylines. To be honest with you.
Are there any black or brown writers on EastEnders?
You know, I don't know of any. There are some black writers, but I don't know of any brown ones other than I wrote something that's not really even EastEnders. But yeah, I'm not sure. We've got some script editors, but yeah, no one who actually writes. I don't think, unless I'm being horribly yeah. That yeah. Yeah. So I think there aren't any pressures. I don't see any pressure. I mean, we tackled a pretty controversial storyline with a gay Muslim storyline, and everyone was like, you know, you're going to have to like, you're not going to be able to leave your house because people are going to like try and kill you. That didn't really happen, and so I don't know whether people were just, you know, overreacting before it even happened, or whether we did it well enough that people went, actually, fair enough, and we didn't have any sort of real backlash to it. We've not really had a backlash to any of the stories we've tried to tackle, so they've done a fairly good job. But then I wouldn't say they're playing it safe either, because they've done that storyline. It was quite risky, and they did another storyline last year which was quite risky. So yeah, I'm not sure if there are any expectations. I'm not hearing about them, and if they're being put forward, then hopefully they're being listened to. I mean, I'd love to hear what people would like to see from the show, and I'd sure try and pass it on. Yeah.
Right, so we've got time for one very quick round of questions. Aisha, your hand was up first. So,
first of all, I'd like to compliment the Runnymede Trust for engaging with this discourse. I think it's very important work, and congratulate the panel for taking part in this, because again, you know, the discourse doesn't happen unless we have kind of fronters, which you are today. There was one thing I did want to talk about, which was something that Idris spoke about. I don't agree with all of your ideas, Idris, unfortunately. However, I do think you touched... Oh, sorry, is it?
He's going to play James Bond.
Sorry.
Idris is
Bond.
This is not Bond at all.
Well, anyway, one of the things that you mentioned was a kind of neutralization of some of the black role models in film. Particularly mentioned was, what was it? hustle. And I think this is really interesting that these particular characters are, I think, would be deemed as quite well educated in positions of power, and it's those stories that aren't being communicated to an audience, but the kind of more ghettoized stories are being communicated. I think that's quite an interesting perspective. In addition, I just want to share a bit of information with everybody that some stats came out around the secondary school intake across the country, being a third of our secondary school population are people of colour, which means that the next generation will be, I would assume, in the media will be growing inevitably because the population is changing. Based on that, I just wanted to ask a question to the panelists about decisions and whether any of the panelists are part of a mentoring program themselves.
Questions? I can't take all these questions now. There are two questions at the back and one at the front. Yeah, if you could be really quick, that'd be really helpful.
Okay. I just wanted to make a general comment, and that is just to draw on what Imran did say. I do agree with the fact that there is a difference between talking about race and racism, because in film you've got to remember that those are representations of culture, and if they don't show those cultures of those people, it's true, like, you know, what the cultures are. Fair enough, not everyone is like that, but it does have a representation of that culture. And I don't think that's racism. I feel like racism only comes in respect of how people are treated behind the scenes in terms of real life situations, like even people trying to get into the industry. I feel like that's what racism is.
This lady in the red jacket.
Who are actually looking after my grandchild at home. And although you're talking about films, etc., I have been watching children's television. Now, I'm very for our black things on television, and I'm talking about Rasta Mouse and the Tinga Tales, etc. I've recently got into them. I am very keen that the Rasta Mouse guy has got on and is forward, but I would like to see a little bit more in terms of the variety, instead of only people stealing, etc. That's one point. I think he has a lot more that he can offer instead of that. And I know he shouldn't be charged with representing the whole of the thing, but inevitably that's what comes across. In terms of this gentleman is saying about the old sin, etc., we do see people on the television, and we do try and we do expect a lot from them. So it is right that, you know, the BBC do consider all that. This gentleman said he's in the newsroom and you know, it's a disproportionate amount of people. It is a lot of pressure. I know when you're in an organization, and I was in the NHS, sometimes you have to try to conform, and you can't always, you try to change things from the inside, but again, you get labeled as problematic. So I do feel that our young audience has a lot to be living up to, and I do want to applaud you all for putting on and hearing all these controversial issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Every time I look up, there are more hands going up, but that's not fair. Gentleman in the hat just here. We'll take this gentleman here, and then lady in the front row, and that will be it, I think.
I was just gonna say about, like, in film, for instance, like Ill Manners. I watched that, and I was just thinking, has the, like, representations of disadvantaged people been, like, dissolved over, you know, well, race, as you would say? Because in Ill Manners, it's not just an all black cast. It's a range of different ethnicities, and they're all from we're not all from disadvantaged backgrounds. Some people through situations have come to a point in their lives where they have become disadvantaged. And I wanted to ask, do you think that this looking to be disadvantaged has been dissolved over ethnicity? Really, yeah.
Imran raised a question about okay. Imran raised a question about the power relations in the industry as a whole. And I just wondered if anybody in this room thinks that the current state of decision-making power is going to change, recognizably in the next 10, 20 years, because the issue is who's making the decisions at the top level. Whatever happens at kind of actor level and, writer level, that's one thing. But it's very much the relations of power right at the top. And I think that that's an issue that Imru raised, which doesn't seem to have kind of,
Final question, just here in the front row. Yeah, you have to speak up, please.
Okay. I wanted to specifically ask to the lady filmmaker. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but I'm a filmmaker myself, and I wanted to ask your opinion about, in terms of as a director or a producer, what you felt about representation, and in terms of the kind of characters you brought for your stories. Do you feel that there are certain pressures that are expected of you to bring light to stories of people of ethnicity, as opposed to, for example, I don't know if you know many about the Twilight films. The first film was actually made by a woman, and it then was franchised into male directors. I kind of worry about whether, as ethnic filmmakers, we have pressures of not being investable to take things on a further level, and I wondered what your opinion was about that.
Fantastic range of questions. You don't all have to answer all of them, but it would be interesting to hear from you as well, as we're kind of wrapping up, what your hopes are for the future, and what you would like to see change. No pressure then, Victoria. Do you want to start?
I'm just thinking where I want to start. I'll start with your question because I remember it. So, in terms of pressure, I remember I had one of my mentors said to me, basically, I have two kind of good anchors to use, and one of that is the fact that I'm a female, and the second is the fact that I'm black. And most of the organizations, they kind of want to have the tick the box of, we've got diversity in women and as well as in colour, so that means I'm perfectly like a shoe-in. And so for one, use that to your advantage. But secondly, I don't feel like I get pressure in terms of particular stories I want to write. I just feel that the stories I want to write are interesting enough that aren't being shared, because there's not enough of us in there to kind of pitch our ideas, so that basically they can get picked up. So in that respect, and it's by happens that's what my interest lies anyway. And there was another question which I wanted to answer, but I can't remember what it is.
Actually, we'll come back to you. Himesh, do you want to?
I think there were a couple of points that sort of link, which is what do we want to do to change things, and the gentleman up there who said that it's inevitably going to change over the next decade or so. And I think, again, positivity, my positivity is linked to that, in the fact that hopefully over the next decade or so, people of different ethnic backgrounds will continue rising up the ladder, as it were, to the place where they can make decisions, and they can finance stuff that previously wouldn't have been financed, and they're willing to take risks on stuff because they want the story told as much as the people writing the story and the people directing and the people acting in the story. So I hope to write anything that if I feel like I want to write something that would maybe change a perception or change people's thinking and maybe stamp out some ignorance that might still be present. That's something I'd like to do, and I hope that I'll get the support to do it. And that's what I'm going to do from my standpoint, and try and get involved in projects that change perceptions and try and stamp out racism try and stamp out racism. We can only try. I hope it'll happen eventually, but yeah, that's what I'm going to do from my point of view, and I think it's great that we can be in these positions where we're in the media. We can at least try and do our best from where we are now to change the course of the future, hopefully.
Sorry, I remembered it now. And it was to answer your question over there about kind of being mentors and stuff. And I fully agree, because mentors are needed for the new generations that are coming up. And one of the things that I do is that I run a film academy called Iconic Steps Film Academy. And in that way, we look for young people who want to get into the media industry, who are generally from disadvantaged backgrounds, so that it doesn't focus specifically on race or anything. And our aim is to give them the skills, just as if they went to film school. So we use professional equipment, we get their films screened in the British Film Institute, we try and invite professionals down to see their films, see their own ideas and what they want to get made and what they want to be said. But I take it one step further, because that's all well and good, but people could come and then they leave and that's the end of it. But I also try and bring people down who are in the industry, and I tell them, if you're coming down and you want to speak to these students, you're going to be opening up your email addresses, and if you want to as well, numbers. And the whole point of that is to get them to be mentors as well, to create a dialogue, because at the end of the day, it's all about contacts to get into the industry, to get behind the scenes, to make the films you want to get made. And the way you need to do that is through people you know, because if I'm going to make a film, I'm going to get the people that I know who are trustworthy around me to help me make the film. If I don't know you, most likely it'll be harder for you to get there. So if they have a dialogue with people that are in there and they realize that that is the career path they want to take, then they've got at least a fighting chance.
I'll just touch on something else we've mentioned before tonight. It's about the British experience in particular. And similarly, I was in the US only a few weeks ago, and it always surprises me, well, I shouldn't be surprised now, as to how it seems it's so much more diverse on television there. And I think it's good that we have that, but sometimes we've got to be careful that it's not a direct comparison, purely because the US is so much bigger. The population there, I think of African Americans in the US is about 12% of the population, whereas here it's around 5%. And I think because there are black networks and Asian networks over in the US, and we don't have that here, and there's a greater deal of execs and commissioners who are high up in those networks, and because the group's a big cohort, it's a lot easier to get those programs made, and it's why actors from the UK have had to leave here, like David Harewood and Lily James has gone recently, and a few others who I can't remember off the top of my head, who've gone to the US for those kind of opportunities which aren't available here. And because of that, we've kind of been starved, and so we put so much hope and expectations on, when we see a black program, that it's going to be satisfying all the things that we want in one program or in one character. And it's so, I feel for the actors who are in that position, really, because it's a huge pressure, and maybe it's a bit unfair on them. But I think hopefully we can turn that pressure around and put that on the people at the top, the commissioners. The lady over there mentioned the fact that this year, I think you mentioned that there are about 30% of the intake at primary schools are black or mixed race. Is that for London or? Oh wow, okay. Wow. Okay, that's an amazing figure. I mean, and I mentioned earlier on how Greg Dyke said 10 years ago the BBC is hideously white, and he said that at the time when there were basically no commissioners, no senior managers at the BBC who were black, and that situation is slowly changing. But I think it's going to take time, and that's not what people want to hear, and it's really quite sad, and it can be depressing. But I think basically with improved mentoring and a realization that actually it's really important for audiences that we are representative of the people that we serve, that's the way that we can change things around. Someone asked if I did some mentoring. I do with the Media Trust, and I mentor a young student. She's about 21, and she's just starting off in journalism. I'm trying to change her mind, tell her not to, but she's quite keen. And my hopes, I'll give you some names just why I'm optimistic for the future. Steve McQueen, Richard Ayoade, Noel Clarke. These guys who weren't around 12 years ago, and now they're seen as being some of the leading lights in British television, drama, and in film, not just here, but also in the US too. So it's only 3 names, and I'm hoping there are going to be very many more soon. But those
Yeah,
guys.
thanks a lot, bruv.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't want to.
Taking a piss.
I didn't want to both. Sorry. I was building up to you. And Riz. So of course, there's reason for optimism and reason to be optimistic. And so that's how I feel about it. And Rasta Mouse is just a kids program, isn't it? I mean. I don't want to dismiss it by saying it's just a kids program.
Can we just finish on the panel? Thanks. I mean, we can have discussions.
But what I'm saying is, because Rasta Mouse, obviously it's an important children's program, but obviously because there aren't very many, we automatically have so many expectations for one program, and that in itself is the problem. Not that Rasta Mouse. Rasta Mouse isn't the answer for everything. Rasta Mouse isn't the answer. That's what I'll say. Not the answer.
I'll be quoting you on that one. Right?
Not the answer.
Riz, and there's a direct question about ill manners, and something we haven't really kind of looked at. We have mentioned in passing is the relationship between race and class. This kind of calling things urban as a way of talking about race but not talking about race. I mean, what's going on in that space?
I think it's very interesting actually at the moment. Like the conversation seems to really, in the wake of the economic crisis and the 7/7 kind of fades from the kind of immediate kind of broadcasting cycle memory. I think the conversation has really moved on to be about class and about kind of economic disparity in this country. And I think it's important that race doesn't get lost in that mix. And I think that's a really interesting point that you're making. But having said that, that's a kind of glass half empty way of looking at the ill manners. But I'm quite proud of the fact that, for example, the character I played in Ill Manners, I mean, he was brown. He goes out saying he was brown. I'm brown. But there wasn't a thing made of it at all. And it didn't really matter. And it was a similar kind of thing that happened in Shifty, which is a much smaller film that I did a few years ago. And I kind of feel like if we talk about class, as long as it's not a whitewashed version of talking about class, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Personally, I'm not a fan of the idea of there being, black programs and then Asian programs and black films and Asian films. I like the idea of people reappearing into the mainstream, and I think that if it's a holistic conversation about class, I think that can be something that's very positive. Just to kind of wrap up, there's a lot of really interesting points made. Something Warren was talking about was about the pressure of representation. I'd say if there's a lot of aspiring filmmakers here, people that want to work in the media, I'd say free yourself of that pressure of thinking that you have to tell the story of your entire social background, your entire race, your entire hometown in everything that you do, because you're representing for everyone. I understand, you're flying the flag whether you like it or not, but if you try and second guess it and try and tick every box and try and put forwards this at the end of the day, you are making art. You are telling stories, and it's about finding a story that's truthful and that resonates with people and that humanizes them, as Imru says. And you were talking about representation versus realism, and I think it's true that a lot of people watch films and they think about every character's representation. Every character is an archetype of some way. But I can tell you, as a fact, that's not how people make stories. When writers are trying to write stories, when actors are trying to find characters, they're not talking about what this character represents. They're trying to find the truth and the realism of it. So I'd say if you're a filmmaker, embrace your truth and don't worry about ticking the boxes. Leave that for rooms and events like this, but don't take them into your study when you're writing about them, I'd say. And just the final thing I'd say is about, I think it kind of works in 3 stages. I think you have the stereotypes that are represented. Then I think you have the stereotypes being overturned. And finally, I think you have representations that are liberated from, any kind of racial stereotypes. I think that's the holy grail we're trying to move towards. And I think we are nearly getting there. But the only way we'll fully get there is by changing the personnel at the top. And I want to be involved in your mentorship schemes, basically.
I would just want to say I wouldn't see it so much as a holy grail, but as an ongoing process. And that process is going to unfold in ways we probably might not be able to predict. I don't think there's going to be a point where we arrive and say this is it. There might be a point we arrive and say this is distinctly different from another era. But there are always going to be battles as long as there are differentiations, power struggles, and power disparities wherever. Now, we've been talking about a lot of things, and I hope that in what I said earlier, I tried my best not to simplify the situation. There's so many issues have come up, and I think I tried to say from the beginning, we're talking about something quite complex, even in the terminology. And thank you for the point you made, because once again, I want to say I don't dismiss, and I'm fully aware of the diversity within the term Africa, the diversity within the term Caribbean, the diversity within the term Asian, and even the diversity in the term African Caribbean. In the term black and white equally. We use them in certain shorthand terms, and I hope I said we need to be alert to the context within which we use these terms and their limited use within certain kinds of discourse, right? When I say African Caribbean in this context, I'm speaking about people from the African continent and people from the Caribbean, which you can't distinguish racially, hence the redundance of that term, yes? And I'm quite aware that the diaspora experience, and this is one of my contentions with Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, for example, who I have a lot of respect for in terms of the overall work, that their conceptualization of diaspora is very limited to a Caribbean slave narrative, which does not take into consideration the African continent and its people and its own diasporic experiences. That's why a film like Welcome to the Terrordrome, anybody seen that film? Ngozi Nwura's film, is a very interesting film because it's a film that talks about the slave experience from a Nigerian Igbo perspective. And the whole discourse of diaspora is turned upside down because it's not about longing for some idyllic return home. It's another kind of debate about mythology and how that kind of experience has been negotiated in a very specific part of Nigeria. So the complexity is there. But within British society and within the globe, there are moments when we can constitute as a community, a black community, an African Caribbean community, for example, yes? But the differences cannot be ignored because they are part of our dynamism. Even within the African continent, we still have to deal with those diversities, which is why we have some of the problems we have there. Now, Sim, I just want to wrap up very quickly, just to say that when I talked about the disappearing of characters of people on television, I'm very serious about this because your statement about Greg Dyke is for me an insult. If he can say that 10 years ago, what happened to all the people from the 80s who were there? The BBC, every 10 years, they say there are no black people, let's get some new black people. There are no filmmakers, let's get some new black filmmakers. There is a total institutional, cannibalism within the organization, which disappears and doesn't leave a tradition of continuity so that mentors come from within the structures and change is imminent rather than always desired. That's what I'm talking about. If he can say that 10 years, then he doesn't recognize what happened in the 80s. And that's the interesting thing. The BBC has continued, but we have not had institutional mobility or more movement within those institutions. Hence, every 10 years we ask for a new black presence. And this is a problem in Britain. Very different from America. It works differently. They have their own problems. We can't make the comparisons. But basically, I want to just make that point. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we've run out of time. We've gone slightly over time, and thanks to your patience for sticking with us. But we're having what strikes me as a really rich conversation and a really important one. I have to say thank you to London South Bank University for hosting this event. They've been fantastic partners to work with. To the Black Cultural Archive and to the Media Trust for helping us co-sponsor this. But what's clear is that it's crucial that we talk about these issues. And it's crucial that we try and create spaces and find spaces to talk about the way in which our media represents us, what we want from that media, how we can make the changes that we want to see. And it's clear that we shouldn't forget the history. Often we talk about the media as if it's all about now, but it has got a legacy, it has got history, and it's really great to hear the experience on this panel from across generations. We will be producing a film of this event and the Manchester and Birmingham ones so that we can make this discussion go a bit further. So if we contact you and send you that film, can I ask everyone to send it on to a couple of people who they think would be interested? Can I thank our Feedback Films for the work they're doing in making these films? Can I thank Ojiaku, who has been working tirelessly pulling these events together, and the rest of the team at Runnymede. And thank you especially to our panellists, Imre Bakari, Riz Ahmed, Warren Nettleford, Himesh Patel, and Victoria Ije. Let's give them all a round.